First of all, thank you all for coming today for, I believe this might be our first event of the semester because our earlier one got postponed. So I'm quite excited. We have today Professor Maha Nasser from University of Arizona. And it's nice to be doing it on Zoom just because of the, the difficulties of getting people from all over the country and the world sometimes for certain events. So what I'll do is I'll give a quick speaker's bio of the professor, and afterwards there'll be the presentation. And then I know the flyer had mentioned that Professor Brown would be here. He had a last minute timing conflict, so he couldn't make it, but in his place he has sent one of our senior PhD students in the history department, Summer Saeed, whose research I believe touches upon some of the things that might be covered today. So Summer will give a few minutes response and reflections after the presentation, and have the liberty to ask the first few questions, and then we can move on to the audience Q&A after that. So just to start off, Professor Maha Nasser is an associate professor in the School of Middle Eastern and North African Studies at the University of Arizona, where she specializes in the cultural and intellectual history of the modern Arab world. Her book, Brothers Apart, Palestinian Citizens of Israel and the Arab World, which I actually have over here, received a 2018 Palestine Book Award for academic titles. In it, she examines how Palestinian intellectuals connected to global decolonization movements through literary and journalistic writings. She has also published numerous academic articles as well as analysis and public opinion pieces. She is currently working on her next book, A Global History of Palestine's People. And I actually first was exposed to Professor Nasser's research at Princeton University, I think 4 years ago now, when you, I believe you're doing a research sabbatical at the Institute of Advanced Study, if I recall. And so you're giving a presentation there, and it was a really eye-opening presentation at the time, especially for me a little bit because it was some perspectives that I wasn't used to hearing within academia for various sort of reasons of status quo. So it was a very nice presentation, and afterwards I went ahead and got the book. And actually, I didn't realize this before, but on the back cover, one of our own professors, Professor Kola, wrote one of the short paragraph on the back of the book. And if I actually knew that, maybe I would have asked him instead of Professor Brown to be here today. But but I'm sure he'll listen to the recording later on. So I'm really excited for the next book the professor releases in the future. But until now, I'll just give the floor to her for her presentation, and then we'll continue with Summer afterwards.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Mariz, for that lovely introduction and for the invitation. And thank you all for coming out on what is an even later Friday afternoon for you all in this February evening. So thank you once again. So I'll just dive right into it. My talk is called Equality versus Freedom, Continuity and Change in the Demands of 48 Palestinians. And some of what I'll be presenting today is related to my book and my book project, and some of it reflects my more recent thinking around these issues since my book came out now almost 5 years ago. So in May of 2021, as the world's attention was riveted to images of Israel's police raids against Palestinian worshippers in Jerusalem and its bombings of Palestinians in Gaza, thousands of 48 Palestinians, also known as Palestinian citizens of Israel, rose up in protest. Echoing the chants of Palestinians around the world, they pledged their fidelity to Jerusalem and chanted, Hurriya, Hurriya, freedom, freedom. One sign held up in Nazareth and circulated widely on social media read, "So there comes a day when the children of Nazareth play with children of Gaza in Jerusalem," unquote. So in my talk today, I hope to show both the continuities and the changes in the demands of 48 Palestinians and what they mean today. A key continuity is that from 1948 to today, there have been two broad streams of oppositional political discourse, as well as actions, among 48 Palestinians. The first dominated by communist activists and their allies, calls for greater equality for Palestinians of Israel at both the civic and national levels. They tend to frame their calls within an acceptance of the legitimacy of the state of Israel and demands that it lives up to its professed democratic ideals. The second broad stream is dominated by pan-Arab or Qawmi nationalists who are much more dubious about Israel's legitimacy. They are much more likely to frame their people and their movement within the broader Palestinian struggle of liberation against Zionism and Israeli settler colonialism. So those are the continuities. In terms of changes, as I hope to show this afternoon, that while there is a long history of protest among both streams of Palestinians, a paradigmatic shift has occurred in recent years. Whereas in earlier decades, protests were dominated by the communist call for equality, more recently, younger 48 Palestinians are increasingly framing their struggle as an integral part of a broader Palestinian demand for national unity and liberation. In addition, an ascendant Islamic movement also positions 48 Palestinians as defenders of Jerusalem, and specifically AlAqsa Mosque, in ways that further challenge both the communist and the nationalist positions. So I trace the vicissitudes of these changes, and by way of conclusion, offer some thoughts about where I think these continuities and changes may take us. So first, for a bit of background. When Israel was established in 1948, only about 160,000 Palestinians managed to remain in or return to their homes within the armistice lines. They were concentrated in the Galilee in the north, the Naqab in the south, and a central strip of land adjacent to the northern West Bank. And you can see on the map here, those green shaded areas are the areas where Palestinians were concentrated. Over the next several years, the Israeli government confiscated much of their land and confined them to smaller and smaller areas. They were also subject to various discriminatory laws and policies, including a pass and checkpoint system that you see in the picture there on the slide. And many of the discriminatory practices in terms of land, in terms of jobs, in terms of municipal allocation remain in place today. So from the very founding of the state, 48 Palestinians mounted numerous campaigns aimed at contesting Israel's land grabs and its discriminatory treatment of them. During much of the 50s and 60s, these protests were led by members of the Israeli Communist Party, a joint Arab-Jewish party, and the only legal non-Zionist party that allowed Palestinians to join as equal members. As I show in my book, Brothers Apart, members of the Communist Party came to adopt broad concepts of decolonization that emphasized the need for everyone to live in peace and equality, both at home and around the world. They further argued that the Zionist underpinnings of the state led Israel into the lap of imperialist powers, and they denounced the numerous discriminatory policies against Palestinians who remained within the Green Line. But it's important to clarify that the Israeli Communist Party was not an anti-Zionist party. Rather, in keeping with Soviet ideology, it recognized the state of Israel and did not question the fundamental legitimacy of the state. And although it earned the ire of Israeli leaders, it was a legally recognized political party and was allowed to operate. They participated in Knesset elections. The ICP ran lists with alternating Arab and Jewish names. And even though the party only held 1 to 3 seats in any given Knesset during these early decades, it did serve as a venue in which members of Knesset, like Emir Habibi and Tawfiq Toubi, could raise uncomfortable questions about Israel's mistreatment of the Palestinians. In addition, the Arabic cultural outlets of the ICP, including its newspaper Al-Ittihad and its monthly literary journal Al-Jadid, were important outlets for literary and cultural expressions of opposition to state policies, as well as expressions of solidarity with other decolonizing movements. Some of Palestine's most famous poets, including Mahmoud Darwish and Samih al-Qasim, got their start publishing in these pages. It's important too to clarify that while they expressed solidarity with decolonizing movements around the world, Palestinian members of the ICP generally shied away from explicitly linking themselves to the larger Palestinian struggle for liberation. Rather, they defined themselves as an Arab minority in Israel, أقلية عربية في إسرائيل, that faced national discrimination, اضطهاد قومي. So for these communist activists, the solution was for Israel to abandon its discriminatory practices and live up to its professed democratic ideals of equality among all citizens. Dissatisfied with this position, a group of 48 Palestinians with a pan-Arab nationalist outlook formed the Ard, or land movement, in 1959. In contrast to the communist call for decolonization around the world, members of the Arab nationalist camp adopted decolonization discourses that were more specifically anti-Zionist than those of their communist counterparts. They questioned whether Israel can ever be truly Jewish and democratic. And they also identified more openly with Arab decolonization movements, especially the Qawmi nationalist expressions of Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser. They argued that for Palestinians in the Green Line to be truly free, they needed to be part of a pan-Arab, Nasser-led, unified formation. Now, Al-Ard's founders were also more explicitly Palestinian than their communists. Although the group's founding communique in 1959 was careful to acknowledge the state of Israel, it also insisted, quote, "We are a part of the Palestinian people who are in turn a part of the Arab nation," unquote. This transnational dimension of their self-identification challenged the framing of the communists, who sought to position themselves within the Israeli body politic. Given the Israeli leadership's fears of Arab nationalism, and especially Palestinian nationalism, activists who expressed such viewpoints found they had much less political room to maneuver. Al-Ard itself was shut down, their popular newspaper confiscated by the authorities after 12 issues. And this is the 12th of the issue that seemed to have earned the ire of the Israeli authorities. And so the 13th issue was literally ripped off the presses as it was being published. I know, and I interviewed a founder and editor of Al-Ard, who shared with me his private collection, including this issue. And I asked, is there any copy of the 13th issue that was confiscated? And he said, no, they literally took every single one. Undeterred, members of the Ard movement in 1964 applied for formal state recognition as an association. While their proposed articles of association did recognize the state of Israel, it also stated in part, quote, that the party was aimed at, quote, finding a just solution for the Palestinian problem through its consideration as an indivisible unit in accordance with the wish of the Palestinian Arab people, unquote. Now, this language bore a striking resemblance to Articles 3 and 4 of the PLO National Charter. As a result, the Israeli government denied the group's petition, which denial that was upheld at the Israeli High Court. So the fall of the Ard movement, which ultimately led to a number of its leaders being exiled, demonstrated that the Israeli authorities would not tolerate discursive framings that tied Palestinians and Israel to the Palestinian people as a whole, regardless of how carefully worded they were. As we move into the era following the June 1967 war, we see that Palestinian members of the Israeli Communist Party, who now, between 1965 and 77, organized under the Hebrew acronym RAKA. These members of the Israeli Communist Party, or RAKA, continued to call for equal rights within Israel. Government crackdowns on oppositional discourse, coupled with the positions of the Soviet Union, led RAKA to emphasize the so-called 67 issues of occupation and settlements, rather than the so-called 48 issues of Israeli colonization of historic Palestine and the return of refugees. As a result, the party strongly denounced both Israel's land grab during and after the 67 war, as well as its treatment of Palestinians in the occupied territories. And this is a picture of one such protest that was happening as the war was going on June 7th. But Rakah's focus on decolonizing only the lands occupied in 1967 was at odds with the Palestinian national movement in exile, especially as we move into the late 60s and 70s. The Palestinian national movement in exile stressed the need to decolonize all of historic Palestine. Yet Rakah was critical of the Palestinian resistance movement, as well as the broader Palestinian consensus that armed struggle was necessary for the goal of liberating all of Palestine. Yet even these rather moderate positions nonetheless carried a heavy political cost in Israel. Several of Rakah's political and cultural leaders were placed under house arrest, while others were subjected to sunset to sunrise curfews. These measures were aimed at limiting the reach of Palestinian activists in Israel who were critical of the state's policies in the occupied territory. And yet, despite these oppressive measures, Rakah's history of political organizing and institution building, coupled with the political maneuverability that the pan-Arab nationalists did not enjoy, allowed the party to gain steady support over the following years. But as we move into the 1970s, a nationalist challenge emerges. During the early 70s, a new awakening of nationalist thought emerged among younger Palestinian intellectuals inside the Green Line. They had grown up under Israeli rule and were frustrated by the rampant discrimination and inequality they faced. But they were also increasingly aware of Palestinian decolonization discourses beyond their borders. These nationalist liberatory discourses were more uncompromising than before and took into account what happened to the Palestinians in 1948. So for many of these younger Palestinians inside the Green Line, this pan-Arab and Palestinian nationalist rhetoric that emphasized the need to liberate all of Palestine through armed struggle was a more attractive call than Rakah's calls for joint Arab-Jewish cooperation and its refusal to endorse armed struggle. Some of these younger, bolder nationalists also grew more vocal in their criticism of Rakah, arguing that its refusal to examine critically the foundations of the Israeli state and its emphasis on Arab-Jewish cooperation were attempts to assimilate Palestinians into the Israeli state in ways that diluted the Palestinian national cause. So seeking to emphasize their identity as Palestinians, in 1972, several activists based in the Central Triangle town of al-Fahm formally declared the establishment of Abna al-Balad, Sons of the Village movement, Harakat Abna al-Balad. With a mix of Arab nationalists and former communists of various strains, members of Abna al-Balad adopted a dual platform that included, quote, and I'm quoting now, affirmation of the Palestinian identity among the Arab people in Israel and opposition to the Communist Party, unquote. Because Abna al-Balad's members opposed participating in the Knesset elections, because they saw it as legitimizing the Israeli state, they didn't actually pose a direct electoral threat to Rakah. Rakah's main political organizing centered around Knesset and other electoral politics. Yet Abna al-Balad did constitute a fundamental challenge to key Rakah ideological positions. As I said, since 1967, Rakah had emphasized that Israeli withdrawal from the occupied territories was necessary. And they argued further that it was a necessary step towards the establishment of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza Strip. At the same time, Rakah demanded collective and individual equal rights as Palestinian Israeli citizens. So essentially they were an early adopter, Rakah that is, was an early adopter of the two-state solution. In contrast, Abna al-Balad rejected the idea of a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza as defeatist. They argued that the PLO was the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian Arab people, including 48 Palestinians, and this was a position that Rakah vehemently rejected. In short, Abna al-Balad constituted itself as a Palestinian nationalist organization that happened to be within the 1948 Green Line. Despite their differing political outlooks, Abna al-Balad and Rakah joined forces in March 1976, organizing a general strike and coordinating a series of massive demonstrations protesting Israeli land confiscation. Collectively, these actions became known as Land Day. The massive turnout, coupled with widespread outrage over the police killings of 6 unarmed protesters, led to greater politicization among Palestinians in the Green Line. At the same time, this increased political awareness made the ongoing debates between the communists and the nationalists all the more visible. These tensions were especially palpable among youth groups and university students who were debating with each other possible solutions to the conflict and the fate of the 48 Palestinians. This was articulated through an ongoing discussion of the so-called two-state versus one-state debate. In fall of 1976, Fawzi al-Asmar, a 48 Palestinian poet and former member of Al-Ard, who's the one who shared with me his collection of the Ard papers, he had gone to the United States in the early 70s and returned to his homeland in fall 76 on a reporting mission. And so he talked to young Palestinians, particularly university students and activists, and reported what he found in an article that was published in the Journal of Palestine Studies. So Fawzi al-Asmar writes, quote, "I heard from a number of people with whom I talked during my stay that communist political education of Arab youth encourages them to accept the status of an Arab minority in Israel with Israeli identities. A leader of the Rakah party explained this logic as follows." So Fawzi is quoting the leader, who said, "When the Palestinian state is established alongside its sister Israeli state, we shall remain an Arab minority in Israel. Changing the situation will take generations and may never change. Therefore, the best thing is to raise our new generation with this perspective, for in the future, it will help them in keeping their identity intact," unquote. But also al-Asmar reported on critics of this perspective. He cited one student journalist who wrote, quote, now I'm quoting the journalist, who told Fawzi, "If we suppose that a Palestinian state is established in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, then the Palestinians living inside Israel will remain as a persecuted minority. On the other hand, all those Palestinians who were kicked out of their homes in 1948 will move from their current refugee camps to other camps set up for them in the West Bank and Gaza. Subsequently, their status will change but little. If such a solution is carried out, it will solve the problem only for one segment of the Palestinians, namely the ones who've lived for generations in the West Bank and Gaza. The solution to the Palestinian issue will come about only with the establishment of a state after the return of all the Palestinian refugees to their homes. The new state should be a state concerned with individual welfare, emphasizing collective humanity and not racial distinctions," unquote. So therefore, what I garner from Fawzi al-Asmar's reporting is that while the Rakah leaders of the late 70s defended their support for a Palestinian state in terms of pragmatism, their nationalist critics argued that a two-state solution, even if it were to come about, which they had doubts about, still would not address the ongoing oppression of the Palestinians living as a minority in Israel. For these nationalists, the best solution was a single democratic state that would be free of ethno-national preferences. So these debates continued throughout the 1980s. By this time, Rakah had reorganized once again into its current iteration, which is known as the Democratic Front for Peace and Equality. You may have also heard it referred to by its Hebrew acronym Hadash, or its Arabic acronym, or its Arabic shorthand, Jabha. So Jabha's members ran for seats in the Knesset on a platform of establishing a Palestinian state in the occupied territories and achieving equality, full equality for all Israeli citizens. Meanwhile, Abnat al-Balad, which still refused to run candidates in the Knesset seats, used its public platforms to call for the establishment of a secular democratic state in all of Palestine. But this position was undermined in 1988 by the PLO's Declaration of Independence, which limited a prospective Palestinian state to the West Bank, Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem. It offered de facto recognition of Israel while effectively excising the 48 Palestinians from the Palestinian National Project. For many 48 Palestinians, the PLO's new policy, along with the 1993 Oslo Accords, famously captured in this image, sent a clear message that they needed to stake their political claims within the Israeli state. The 1990s saw Israeli government policies that allowed for greater freedom of movement and expression, and Zionist parties, especially Labor and Meretz, sought to expand their quote-unquote Arab sectors. In response, many Palestinian citizens, or 48 Palestinians, became convinced that waiting for a comprehensive solution to Palestine was futile. They began participating in Israeli cultural and national events, arguing that with the PLO engaged in direct talks with Israel, it was only a matter of time before an independent Palestinian state would be established, Israel's security concerns would be alleviated, and they would be able to enjoy full integration and equality within the Israeli state. But such optimism soon faded. Throughout the 90s, Jewish Israelis, including those on the Zionist left, began to emphasize the state's Jewish character more clearly than before, highlighting the limits of Palestinian equality within a Zionist framework. The 1996 election of Likud Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, for the first time, further undermined Palestinian hopes for equality as he formed coalitions with far-right and religious Zionist parties whose leaders denounced vociferously even the prospect of integrating Palestinians into Israel. So these discursive shifts led some Palestinians to conclude that the existing Arab parties were insufficiently prepared to address these changing political conditions. As a result, in 1995, some members of Abna al-Balad, along with organizers dissatisfied with Jabha's direction, founded the National Democratic Assembly, also again known today by its Hebrew acronym Balad and its Arab shorthand Tajamma. It was a political party that aimed to contest Knesset elections by offering a more pointed critique of the political limitations for Palestinians in Israel. Tajamma, or the NDA, not only demanded equal rights for Palestinians at both the civic and national levels, which is something that the communists have been doing as well, but it also called upon Israel to transition from being a Jewish state to being a, quote, a state of all its citizens, unquote. In doing so, members of Tajamma aimed to secure more space in the public sphere for their liberationist anti-colonial discourse, while still working within the then dominant discursive framework of a two-state solution. These decades of the 1980s and 90s also witnessed another important development, one that is often overlooked in the discussions of 48 Palestinians, and that is the rise of the Islamic movement. And I apologize, the picture here is a little fuzzy, but I will explain it. So prior to 1967, 48 Palestinians had been unable to travel to Arab countries. The occupation following the '67 war paved the way for Palestinians to connect or reconnect with their fellow Palestinians across the Green Line in both directions. So 48 Palestinians in the 70s and 80s traveled frequently to the occupied Palestinian territories to study, to visit, and to attend institutes for religious training. This not only deepened ties between Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line, but also ushered in more widespread religious consciousness among Palestinian Muslims inside the Green Line. This consciousness was formalized with the establishment of the Islamic movement in the 1980s. Its focus was on social activism, charitable work, and educational activities that the Israeli state had neglected. So they organized, for example, scores of volunteers to clean up and restore mosques and cemeteries, which is what you see here. And it mobilized to challenge Israeli state control over Islamic institutions and waqf properties. During the Oslo Accords, Israel began to use legal and bureaucratic means to quietly try to alter the status quo in the old city of Jerusalem. In 1996, for example, it opened the northern entrance It opened the northern entrance to a tunnel that ran under the Western Wall, which supports the Aqsa Mosque compound, leading to widespread protests. Palestinians everywhere grew alarmed at these changes, but the PLO was limited in what it could do in Jerusalem based on the Oslo Accords. In that absence, the Islamic movement stepped in. Shortly after the tunnel opening, the leader of the movement's northern branch, Ra'ad Salah, organized a conference in al-Fahim, where he was served as mayor. It was convened under the banner, AlAqsa is in danger, AlAqsa fi khatar. The conference grew into an annual rally that drew tens of thousands of 48 Palestinians from across the country to Fahim's main stadium. Each year, attendees listened to speeches and songs and testimonials from activists and religious leaders, both Muslim and Christian, who reiterated the holiness of Jerusalem's religious sites and emphasized the responsibility of Palestinians to work together to liberate them collectively from Israeli occupation. This refrain, AlAqsa fi khatar, gained added urgency in the new millennium as the Israeli government began to support a growing network of extremist settler and religious Zionist groups seeking to establish full Israeli control over occupied East Jerusalem, including the Old City and its holy sites. The most extreme among them wished to destroy the Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock in order to rebuild the third Jewish temple. The outbreak of the Second Intifada in September 2000 brought about a number of changes. First, it underscored the gap between Jewish and Palestinian citizens even further. As Israel killed dozens of Palestinians in the occupied territories during the first few days of the uprising, 48 Palestinians expressed their outrage by declaring a general strike, followed by a wave of protests. In response, Israeli security forces killed 13 unarmed Palestinians, and these killings were a major blow to those Palestinians who believed that their Israeli citizenship protected them from lethal force. And the pictures you see here are both on the one side is a commemoration of the 13 protesters who were killed in October 2000. And on the right-hand side is a memorial that was built to them in Nasser. So as 48 Palestinians are recognizing that all of their attempts at integration in the 90s amounted to nothing, essentially. In addition to that, Israel shut down Palestinian institutions in East Jerusalem, severely restricting the ability of Palestinians living in the West Bank and Gaza Strip to enter the city. These measures were a setback to the growing connections emerging between Palestinians on both sides of the Green Line. But it also marked a shift in the relationship that many 48 Palestinians had with Jerusalem. Since Palestinian citizens of Israel faced fewer restrictions on travel to the city and its holy sites, Salah and other Northern Branch activists organized bus convoys to take Palestinian citizens to the Aqsa Mosque for Friday prayers and other religious services. They also continued to hold these Aqsa is in danger rallies, further emphasizing their responsibility towards Jerusalem as Palestinians who have access to the city. To give you one example, between 2001 and 2004 alone, the Northern Branch of the Islamic movement facilitated over 2 million visits of 48 Palestinians to Jerusalem. Meanwhile, the Israeli government, led by a series of far-right and center-right parties, passed laws that were even more discriminatory against Palestinian citizens than in the past. In 2003, the Knesset passed an amendment to the citizenship law that prevented Palestinian citizens to be able to bring their Palestinian spouses in from the West Bank and Gaza Strip. In 2007, this law was expanded to apply to spouses from the quote-unquote enemy states of Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and Iraq. In part, these laws were promulgated to try to counteract the rise of a new generation of more assertive Palestinian citizens who were emerging onto the political scene. Born during the last quarter of the 20th century, These 48 Palestinians came of age during the tumultuous years of the Second Intifada and became increasingly vocal in asserting their identity as Palestinians. Importantly, this included spearheading collective actions that commemorated events significant to the Palestinian people as a whole. This can be seen in the rise of annual observances of Yom al-Nakba, particularly through the return marches, Masirat al-Awda, in which 48 Palestinians hold commemorative events in villages whose lands have been confiscated by the state. And this is a picture of one from 2019. These observances and Masirat al-Awda have grown over the past decade, despite the passage of the Nakba law that threatens to cut government funds for NGOs that partake in Nakba observances. Such defiance is part of a larger shift in Palestinian discourse and strategic thinking that seeks to reframe the struggle of 48 Palestinians in terms of colonialism, and more specifically settler colonialism, that has longer lineages and wider implications than the two-state solution discourses and equality discourses had previously had. At the same time, the growing matrix of control that prevents Palestinians in the occupied territories from entering Jerusalem, coupled with the mounting extremism of Israeli religious Zionists, has convinced many 48 Palestinians that they have a duty to protect Muslim and Christian holy sites from Zionist extremists. This is an important context for understanding the events of last spring. Well before the first rocket was launched from Gaza, throughout Ramadan 2021, Palestinians watched in dismay as Israeli police harassed and attacked Muslim worshippers from Jerusalem and beyond who had come to the AlAqsa mosque compound to break their fast and to pray the Ramadan Tarawih prayers. The mounting attacks, which were broadcast live on social media, traditional media, outraged Palestinians, which helps us understand why on May 8th, 2021, thousands of 48 Palestinians boarded buses and climbed into cars headed towards Jerusalem. The holiest night of Ramadan was approaching, Laylat al-Qadr, and they planned to break their fast in the old city and to join in Tarawih prayers at the AlAqsa mosque compound. But their convoys were halted when Israeli police vehicles blocked all the inbound lanes of the main highway leading to Jerusalem, which is what you see on this picture here. Undeterred, hundreds decided to complete the last few miles on foot. So you can imagine these scenes, which were going viral on social media, and I was following it in real time. So there were these scenes being shared on social media of fasting Palestinian Muslims, 48 Palestinian Muslims, fasting, walking under the hot afternoon sun, because it's Asr time now. It was a warm day, it was in the upper 80s. So they're walking and sweating on the highway in the afternoon sun in order to pray at one of their holiest sites. So as these images went viral, Jerusalem's residents, who have a distinct license plate color and were able to go on the outbound, so what they did was they traveled outbound on the empty highway, on the blocked highway. And so they went out in their own cars to pick up their fellow Palestinians and give them a ride into the city. After a few hours, the police relented and allowed the bus convoys to go through. And that night, an estimated 90,000 worshippers prayed at the AlAqsa mosque compound. The next day, on Sunday, May 9th, thousands of 48 Palestinians took to the streets to express support for their fellow Palestinians in Jerusalem, as well as their besieged brothers and sisters in Gaza. Their chants and songs echoed the calls for freedom heard across the occupied territories, indicating that they saw themselves as part of a joint Palestinian struggle for liberation. In the central town of Lid, one Palestinian protester scaled a lamppost and replaced the Israeli flag with a Palestinian one. So these actions of May 8th, May 9th, and May 10th led to what became known as the Unity Intifada of May 2021. 48 Palestinian activists, many of them women, framed their actions as part of a collective struggle, a collective Palestinian struggle for national liberation. rather than a call for equality within the Israeli state. The sense of collective struggle is also reflected in the Dignity and Hope Manifesto, which was released on May 18, the day of a national strike. The manifesto affirmed, quote, "The Palestinians are one people," unquote. They argue that Zionism has sought to defeat the Palestinians by, quote, "turning us into different societies, each living apart, each in its own separate prison," unquote. The solution, according to the manifesto, therefore, lay in, quote, "reuniting Palestinian society in all of its different parts, reuniting our political will and our means of struggle to confront Zionism throughout Palestine," unquote. So what's notable here is that the manifesto disregards any attempt to appeal either to liberal notions of equality within Israel, or makes any indication that the Palestinians in different political locations are separate somehow in their struggle. Rather, they argue that Zionism is fundamentally irreconcilable with Palestinian liberation and must be defeated in order for Palestinians anywhere to live free. Now, to be sure, the Israeli state tried very hard to quell this movement. In May, protesters across both sides of the Green Line, but particularly inside the Green Line, 48 Palestinians faced attacks from the Israeli police and extremist Jewish Israelis, and over 2,048 Palestinians were detained and arrested, many of them teenagers and young adults. But it's unclear what long-term effects such measures will have. Reflecting on the previous week's events, one activist noted, quote, "The arrests and detentions and the terrorizing practices inside the country will not intimidate us and will not dampen our enthusiasm, but rather the opposite. It will make us a generation that is more and more angry." So to conclude, even as their struggle recedes from international headlines, 48 Palestinians are still debating the best way forward. Community leaders, Knesset members, and activists from established political parties continue to call for equality within Israel, arguing that it is the most pragmatic way to improve their people's daily living conditions. And we can turn to the leaders of the Joint List, more recently the Mansour Abbas, who joined the ruling coalition, who makes this argument repeatedly that we are Arab citizens of Israel seeking equality. But for many outside the traditional political establishment, and particularly among the youth, these calls for patience and pragmatism are no longer convincing. They believe they will never be able to exist as Palestinians in a state dominated by the logic of Zionism. And like young people around the world, they are much more savvy at connecting the dots between different levels and forms of oppression. They see local problems as manifestations of larger structures of oppression, marginalization, and violence. This is why even local campaigns that 48 Palestinian activists undertake, such as those against gun violence and criminality, as well as those against gender-based violence, are nonetheless rooted in an analysis that challenges the larger structural violence and settler colonialism of the state. Lastly, we've seen this most recently in the protests in the Naqab over the last month or two, organized and led largely by young Palestinian women from Bedouin backgrounds, who are once again calling attention to the fundamental contradictions of the Israeli state and are rejecting the possibility of Palestinians ever achieving equality within a Jewish Zionist state. For those of you who are unfamiliar with the protests, a few months ago, the Israeli state announced forestation plans to plant trees on Bedouin lands without consulting with the residents. The plan would further constrain them and confiscate an already diminished sector of confiscated lands. So you have a number of young women, as Janine al-Azraq, whom you see pictured here, as well as Adnan al-Hujouj, who's only 18 years old, who spoke quite eloquently to international media and told them, quote, "The plan of the Israeli government now has been the same since 1948. It has been the same since the Nakba, and it will continue being the same unless we stop it." So this sense of not only clarity of purpose, but also a sense of confidence in their ability, I think reflects where we're headed in the future. As young, digitally connected 48 Palestinians will likely continue to insist that only by defeating Zionism as a political ideology and dismantling the settler colonial state upon which it's built, will they finally be able to live in their homeland in dignity and freedom. And thank you very much.